Welcome. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to our distinguished panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment. I'm Aaron Einbond. I'm lecturer in music here at City University. And in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the music department, we're hosting a series of public debates, of which this is the second, on the topic of gender and music technology. I'll begin with a brief introductory statement, and then I'll introduce the panelists, be followed by discussion, and then open to the floor for questions. And we really invite you to share your thoughts and experiences and ideas with us at the end. So technology is now central to many music-making practices across all sectors, yet men greatly outnumber women in the field of music technology. And because it is vertically separated by gender, men also occupy most of the positions of authority. Higher education courses featuring music technology are also dominated by men, and gender segregation in technical courses at high school level is widespread and pervasive. What can be done to address gender balance and gender bias within music technology? What kinds of radical interventions and new ways of thinking about the ways we interact with and teach music technology might make a difference? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the 9 justices of the US Supreme Court, has said, "When will there be enough women on the court?" And my answer is when there are 9, namely all of them. Should this be our goal for music technology, and how far away are we? How does this topic relate to larger issues of gender in music and gender in technology, each problematic in themselves, especially when the relationship of humanities to STEM disciplines, as will be debated here in the next debate this Friday, is currently receiving so much attention? How will the demographics of music technology education affect the future relations of music, gender, and class? How do they relate to other lacks of diversity, such as age, disability, and ethnicity? And you're looking at an image here from Sound and Music's website, where they've tracked applicants' data to their programs by not only gender, but if you scroll down, you'll find many other disturbing statistics. So not all a topic for today's debate, but something that I'm sure we'll touch on. What should existing professional organizations of electronic musicians do to help, and how are new organizations making a difference? And finally, where can we look for examples of positive steps that point a way forward? What fundamental new approaches, practices, and even technologies are most promising? I'm delighted to introduce the panelists, who will each present a short statement in alphabetical order from left to right. Victoria Armstrong, whose work is primarily concerned with issues of educational inclusion with a primary focus on gender and education. Her monograph, Technology and the Gendering of Music Education, published by Ashgate, which has drawn widespread critical acclaim, brings together feminist perspectives from the sociology of science and technology studies and musicology to explore how gendered identities are constructed and performed in relation to digitally mediated compositional process. She has continued to research gender in music and is currently working on a project entitled Women's Musical Lives, which explores the experiences of female classical musicians working in a freelance capacity. This has resulted in a recent conference paper and published article in the journal Women, A Cultural Review. She's currently working on a funded research project entitled Transitions and Trajectories, which examines the musical experiences of pupils as they transfer into the first year of secondary education, focusing on motivation and music progression. The project began in July 2014 and is due to be completed this April. Next, we have Georgina Bourne, professor of music and anthropology at Oxford University and a professorial fellow of Mansfield College. Previously at Cambridge, and earlier in life, who worked as a musician on cello and bass guitar, performing with the group Henry Cow, among others. Her work combines ethnographic and theoretical writings on music, media, and cultural production, often focusing on major institutions, television production at the BBC, computer music at IRCAM, interdisciplinary art science and new media at UC Irvine. Her books are Rationalizing Culture, Rationalizing Culture, IRCAM Boulez, and the Institutionalization of the Musical Avant-Garde, Western Music and Its Others, Difference, Representation, and Appropriation in Music, and Uncertain Vision, Bert Dyke and the Reinvention of the BBC. 2 edited books published in 2013 were Music, Sound, and Space, and Interdisciplinarity, Reconfiguration of the Social and Natural Sciences. From 2010 to 15, she directed the research program Music, Digitization, Mediation towards Interdisciplinary Music Studies, funded by the European Research Council, which examines the transformation of music and musical practices by digitization and digital media through comparative ethnographies in 7 countries in the developing and developed world. Then we have Simon Emerson, professor in music technology and innovation at De Montfort University, who went there after many years as electroacoustic music studio director here at City. As a composer, he is committed to live performance with electronics and has now 40 years of work reflecting the changing technology of music. Commissions include works for leading soloists, ensembles, and festivals. CDs of his work have been issued by Continuum and Sargasso. He contributed to and edited The Language of Electroacoustic Music, published in 1986 and still in print, and Music, Electronic Media, and Culture, published by Ashgate. His book, Living Electronic Music, was published also by Ashgate in 2007. He's contributed to the Computer Music Journal, Contemporary Music Review, Journal of New Music Research, and was founding secretary of EMAS, the Electroacoustic Music Association of Great Britain, in 1979, served on the board of the Sonics Arts Network from its inception until 2004, and is a trustee of its successor organization, Sound and Music. And to anchor our panel on the other end is Holly Ingleton, a cultural worker and feminist sound studies scholar whose transdisciplinary performative practice explores sound in an expanded and often dematerialized field through archives, conversations, interventions, hidden herstories, and historical amnesias, tuning into feminist frequencies within sites of the juxtapolitical. She's involved as an archivist and educator for the Her Noise Archive, and founding co-collaborator of Sound, Gender, Feminism, Activism. She has performed and exhibited in the UK, Australia, and Greece, given talks at festivals and symposia internationally, has published in Reflections on Process in Sound and Women and Music, a Journal of Gender and Culture, forthcoming, and recently completed her doctoral research, Composing Paradoxes, Feminist Process in Sound Arts and Experimental Musics. So now I will ask each of our panelists to open with a statement, and we'll begin with Victoria Armstrong, who I should have introduced, is professor at Queen Mary.
I'd love to be a professor, but I haven't got there yet.
Oh, right. Well, I'm from America, I call everybody professor.
But I'll take it. Good evening, and lovely to see so many people. I'm actually going to be focusing largely around looking at some of the issues around inclusion in gender as it relates to what I see as the increasingly sort of technicist framing of music education at secondary level, and that's going to be my focus. And you may then see some parallels, I think, with perhaps Georgie's work when she's looking at what's happening in higher education. The increasing technicist framing of music education since the late 1990s raises important issues about gender and inclusion. And I think this has been largely ignored by policymakers and educators who appear to accept uncritically the arguments made for the use of technology, often as a key remediation strategy in school subjects where boys is perceived as underachieving. So with regard to music education, technology is believed to encourage greater uptake of school music, as the affordances of digital music making are said to appeal to boys and better reflect their needs and interests. And this focus on boys' educational needs is interesting because I think it coincides with a bit of a feminist backlash. Scott Harrison, a music education researcher from Australia, says that gender research in music education has been increasingly dominated by feminist theory, resulting in girls' musical experiences and needs being privileged over their male counterparts. And I absolutely don't believe that that's the case. And I don't think the evidence supports that at all. I think it's the opposite. In fact, I think it's boys' experiences and needs that are being privileged, and the technologised music classroom may turn out to be highly exclusionary. Chris May says that computers are generally applied to already existing social practices, and therefore their use is more likely to improve current practice, not stimulate new social organisations, i.e. gendered social practices aren't challenged in any way, but are actually being reinforced. And I believe these attempts to masculinise the curriculum may in the long run negatively impact on girls, not because girls are less interested or less able in using music technology, they're most certainly not, but it can be more difficult for them to construct a positive technological identity in male-dominated masculinist spaces. And therefore the argument for the need to develop these sort of boy-friendly pedagogies is deeply flawed. And although boys have been constructed as the new victims of schooling, it seems to me that focusing on boys' perceived needs in the music classroom may result in the reproduction of dominant constructions of gender. As we know from the stats behind us and various other studies that have come out recently, men make up the majority of powerful positions in the music industry. Composers studies are usually men, and cool instruments in school orchestras are often played by boys. And as McGregor and Mills say, attracting boys into subjects currently occupied by many girls and marginalised boys may well work to colonise the subject in such a way that girls and marginalised boys' safe spaces within a school are actually reduced. And this would not make for either an inclusive curriculum or an inclusive classroom. So I would therefore suggest that with the introduction of technology, this adds another layer of symbolic masculinity to an already gendered classroom. And this is materially manifested through teachers' pedagogic practices, policy initiatives, and also teachers' perceptions that boys have a greater natural ability for both technology and composition. And this is borne out in a whole range of studies, starting with Lucy Green's work in 1997. And it's not helped by, as we know, some of the problems with women's work not appearing on exam syllabi and in curriculum texts. So the book that Aaron referred to came out about 5 years ago. But if we look at recent Ofsted figures, we see that boys are 5 times more likely than girls to be entered for music technology exams. And Georgie's research showed that males make up over 90% of the student intake of technology-related undergraduate degrees in Britain. So although there's been a bit of a time lag, we can see that in some ways not a lot has changed. I think when we're trying to look for solutions, and we clearly haven't found any, which is why we're carrying on having conversations like this, we need to look beyond the classroom. We've got to look at wider sociocultural processes. Just looking at what's going on in classrooms, in lecture halls, doesn't really work. And we've got to understand those processes that contribute to the ways in which technology has become associated with men and masculinity. Raymond Williams asserts that technology is always, in a full sense, social, and I take that as very much as a starting point in my work. And I think this is a really helpful starting point because the take-up and use of technologies are shaped by the gendered social relations of the world into which they enter, and as such are bound up with issues of power, authority, and forms of control. And the strong cultural connection between masculinity and technology isn't surprising, given masculinity's attempt to define itself by its monopoly control of reason, logic, and objectivity. And so as such, women's marginalisation in the technological sphere means they're less able to contribute to the construction of technology's symbolic and material meanings. One of the big things that comes out of a lot of work is this issue of confidence. Girls often express lower levels of confidence in these sorts of spaces, and trying to understand why that's the case. It's not an inherent aspect of their identity, but it is produced by these sort of socialised expectations of male and female attitudes towards technology. It's not lack of ability, skill or interest on the part of girls, and this is taken from the research I did in the secondary schools a few years ago, which formed the basis of the book. So as I say, it's the gendered practices surrounding the work, the space, the gendering of space, teachers' expectations of who should be good at technology and who isn't. And it's often predicated on the perceptions that males are the experts, both teachers and pupils, a sort of default position, if you like. And Sherry Turkle attributes this to a reticence on the part of women because the computer becomes a personal and cultural symbol of what a woman is not. Therefore, it's not enough to suggest that females are in some way deficient and simply need to acquire technological skill. Rather, they need to own that acquisition at a far more subjective level as part of their overall identities. But this ownership is often inhibited by their exposure to constructions of gender technology relations that posit women as outsiders in technological cultures. But it's important to recognise, and certainly I found this in my work, we mustn't suggest that girls aren't active in constructing and reclaiming spaces. I found this in my work quite a lot, but not in classroom spaces. They couldn't find those spaces in formal education, and this is a real problem, I think. Teachers wouldn't recognise their out-of-school activities. They didn't know. They would presuppose that the girls weren't very technological, but they were largely using technology at home, creating, mixing, doing all sorts of interesting work, but in different kinds of spaces. And here, there's this idea, and this is a problem, I think, because on the one hand, they're exercising agency, and they're circumventing the need to negotiate these overly masculinized spaces of schools. But as I say, by removing themselves from those spaces, they have less opportunities to shape those spaces. And And it was interesting, I'll just flag this up because we are talking about solutions and good practice. Linda O'Keefe from Lancaster University, from WISWAS, Women on Sound, Women in Sound, has been undertaking quite a lot of work, and I attended a symposium last month, and it included academics, practitioners like Holly, girls from the local school doing A-levels, teachers, and we were trying to share our stories, if you like, about our engagement with technology. And time again, it was really interesting that all of the practitioners had sort of found their way to technology outside of formal educational spaces, whether it be at higher education level or at school. So there is something here about this reclaiming of space. So while this can be viewed positively, there is a sense of agency and taking control. The masculinization of an already gendered music classroom, as I say, results in girls possibly losing out in technological spaces because of this symbolic layer of symbolic masculinity. And this should alert us to the need to work towards a music classroom that's truly inclusive and doesn't just play lip service to some notional inclusion agenda. And that in practice really reproduces the very gender inequalities that feminist researchers have challenged for so long. Thank you.
Yeah, let me give you the video. So now we'll continue.
So, well, thank you very much, Erin. It's good to be here, and these are just sort of really to talk to, these slides, but there is a bit of data on them. So it's good to follow Vicky's comment. We've been in dialogue about this for some few years now, because what happened is when I did fieldwork, and a very, very smart PhD student who was working with me, we were working in the UK and Montreal, looking at inside the universities and outside the universities at cultures of post-electronic and post-computer music, what I call digital art musics. And what we found was a very sort of clear observation that inside formal university degrees, for example in Montreal, let's take Montreal, inside the electroacoustic classroom, there was a great predominance of men and very, very many fewer women. The same was true largely in the UK. And yet in the city, outside the universities, a lot of women were involved in circuit bending and sound art practices. And when we took these biographical stories from these women, it was very clear they were often dropouts from formal education in electroacoustic music, and they had created a new practice, and one in which they were often using alternative forms of technology, and not only categorizing themselves as sound artists, but according to the patronage system of the Quebec arts funding bodies, because these women often had no music degree nor an electroacoustic music degree, they could not apply for new music funding. They could apply for arts funding. And that's what they were doing, and they designated themselves sound artists. So we began to be interested in the gender issue. It was not something that I foresaw as a key theme of this work. I want to stress that, nor was it in my EARCAM book, by the way. So what happened is that we decided for the UK only to buy some data. You have to buy it now, you don't get it free, from UCAS, the University Admission Service. This slide is just to follow up on Vicky's opening to say that Lucy Green, in her wonderful and important work in the sociology of music education, has been writing about these themes for 2 decades and more. Those of you who are interested should look at her work. And Vicky has very much inherited and built on this tradition of work, as have others. And we know that there is this pronounced gendering inside both primary schools, secondary education, and so on. In fact, one of the theses that we discuss in our work is one called the leaky pipeline thesis, in which at every stage of educational progress, women drop out, young girls and then teenage girls, and then women drop out progressively from engagement with music technology. So there's something very strange and interesting going on. The third point on that slide is just to say that this preempts where I want to get to, but I guess the outcome of the work that I and my research group began to do on this, the furthest we could go, I guess, which is an interesting question. Why can't we go further in understanding all this? was to say, look, at least what we're looking at the least in relation to music technology at the degree level and after in the professions, is an intersectional problem. And that is the gendering of composition and other high and high prestige areas of the music profession, the contemporary music profession, for example, conducting, and on the other hand, the gendering of technology and of the STEM fields and disciplines. And there's something about the sort of toxic intersection of these two tendencies that we witness the outcome in music technology today. If you're interested, there are two publications that came out of our work. One is a longish essay in 20th century music, published in the autumn, which is about gender, but also class, and in the margins about race and ethnicity in music technology and music degrees in Britain today, and that's based on our UCAS findings. The second thing, which isn't up there, is an issue of the Contemporary Music Review about to appear. It's gone through proofs, in which Holly and Simon and myself have major pieces, and it's a discussion precisely of these issues, not just limited to education, but institutional matters, the gendering of epistemologies and ontologies of sound and other things, which we'll hear about from both of them, I think. The summary of the findings of our UCAS research were that, very, very simple. We took, here's the data set, we took a 5-year period, 2007 to 11, 6 variables. We didn't just want to look at gender, we were interested in ethnicity, and then they don't do class, so they pointed us, UCAS, at 4 other variables in the demographic data that they harvest from admissions to university, applications and admissions, and those are they. And we took class as a sort of amalgam of those 4 other variables up there. School type, what's called polar, I can go into it if you're interested, A-level score, and specifically we were interested in the question of A-levels in music and music technology. We did these, got the data for 12 universities, which we carefully checked. We wanted a spectrum, all the nations of Britain, Russell Group, and lower down the status hierarchy. We checked these universities with an advisory group, including Simon and others. And in those universities, there were 38 degrees, music technology with a focus on arts and creative practices, the BA, BMUS, and on the other hand, those more oriented to the scientific and engineering and technical side, BSc, BEng degrees. So 38 degrees, some of them within the same university, and it would have been great to, and be interesting to do it after the introduction of student fees, which we haven't done, which I'm sure will be interesting in probably quite dramatic ways. Our finding from this data set was very clear. That is, that music degrees in our sample, compared to the national average of all degrees, had a higher class profile than the national average and fewer minority ethnicities, quite dramatically, while the gender profile is balanced according to the national average, which is at the present time 55% women, 45% men. Okay, and this parallels the general wider student population. Music technology degrees, in contrast, were overwhelmingly male, about 90% of admissions were male, lower in striking ways in terms of class profile, lower than the national average, and only slightly more ethnically diverse. So if you want the full interpretation, please go to our 20th Century Music article, which is quite a full, a very full discussion, a lot of it quite speculative of the meaning of these findings. Okay, I really hope you will look at that. In graphic terms, there we are. There's the music degrees on the top line, the BA/BMUS degrees on the second line up there. Blue is female, red is male. The music tech, science and engineering on the third line, and the national average on the bottom. Okay, so quite dramatic findings. I won't go into that in the A-levels. The class profile, interesting just to summarize for you, as I said, a higher class profile than the national average in traditional music degrees, and a lower than national average class profile in the music technology degrees. So I want to rush through this because I'm interested in getting to the kind of entailments and questions. So our conclusions were that there were marked differences in both the gender and class profiles of music and music technology degrees. I should have said we were very interested in the dramatic growth of these degrees, broadly called music technology or titles close to that. Since 1999 and 2011, 1,400% growth in these degrees, and we discuss in the paper why that might be the case. And in as much as we see the dramatic growth of this new kind of music degree, there's a clear question of bifurcating types of degrees in music at the moment, and bifurcating demographics in the way I've described, okay? So we make a number of interpretations. I think this is quite out of date. We make much more nuanced interpretations in the paper. But anyway, negative interpretation of all this would be to say that, there's a tendency for social class differences to be being reproduced through music in higher education. And we can take this back to a kind of Bourdieuian framework as it's been checked, and in fact the whole of Bourdieu's famous study of the late 60s in the book Distinction was redone for Britain in the mid-2000s by Tony Bennett, Mike Savage and others. In the book Culture, Class, Distinction, they published that work, and they find once again that class is one of the key, most significant of demographic variables for differences in musical and cultural tastes. So maybe that's what's partly going on in these bifurcating degrees. The positive interpretation would look at all the points under that heading there. What we're seeing here are the growth in the music technology degrees of an interdisciplinary engagement with aspects of science and technology. And by the way, I was in the work I did, albeit probably at the high end of the music technology degrees, I was quite impressed by the trainings in aspects of science and technology as related to music that I saw. So I don't think this is, a skin-deep form of training. One could say that these degrees are more experimental, more contemporary in their orientation. They obviously offer broader social and cultural access and have new vocational strengths. And this matters to me a great deal. What I think we see in the music technology, sound art, sonic arts sector is a modernizing transition away from more traditional historicist music degrees. And I personally think that that's a tremendously important and interesting phenomenon. And one of the questions we raise in our paper is, does it have to be like this, a kind of bifurcation? How come we can't have curriculum reform, which would mean that the more contemporary orientations are also brought fully into the more traditional music degrees in Britain? So looking forward, I'm really going to only raise questions, and then I'm going to get a bit more personal. So what does all this bode? Again, please look at our paper. We discuss a number of future kind of possibilities and scenarios. Educationally, is this bifurcation of kinds of music degree with serving, as it were, different demographics set to continue? Is it productive? Should it continue, or should it be overcome? How about curriculum reform, modernization, I would call it, of traditional music degrees? Gender, how can? The big question, how can the problematic gendering of music technology degrees and practice and professions be mitigated? As I mentioned in Montreal, also at the level of policy, of funding, of commissions, and so on and so forth. Demographically, there's a much larger question. How can we encourage the diversification of both music and music technology cohorts in terms of class and ethnicity as well as gender? And I personally feel as passionately about that. In terms of race and ethnicity, is there a problem not only of masculinity in the styles of teaching, of creative practice, the technical systems that we encounter in musical work, but is there a problem of whiteness in our music and music technology degrees? Some of you will know there's a very interesting literature on whiteness in the kind of post-colonial and race and studies, black cultural studies now, the work of Richard Dyer, Les Back, and others. And I think that by analogy, as dear male colleagues have said, have pointed out more than I did in the past, this isn't just about the deficit side, it's also about the problematic styles of masculinity that we maybe see being cultivated and passed on. Politics, what kinds of politics are needed? I think, I liked, Holly, you mentioned juxtapolitical in the lead-in, and I think what we need is a various, multiple forms of politics on multiple fronts. A politics of pedagogy at all levels, as the work of Vicky and others shows. That's linked to an epistemological politics, a politics of how we talk about and think about and understand sound and noise and music and so on. We need curatorial and historical politics, as the work of Her Noise, other kind of counter practices of archiving of women's compositional work and music shows. We need institutional politics. I've just been invited to Darmstadt for the first time. And for the first time ever, there's going to be something on gender. We're designing it. We don't yet know what it'll be. But, how's that, 60, 70 years into the power of a summer school like that? We need a politics at the level of commissioning, of concert and event programming. It's very good to hear Sound and Music being so serious about this. All of these things are important. And female pressure is just one initiative. I've very recently been shown the WizWaz initiative. I mean, these things are happening, and that's fantastic and wonderful. I want to mention that one of the problems in our work was that someone of my generation and my formation, I would go to science and technology studies, and there's a tradition of feminist work in science and technology studies, right, from the 70s on. But when we went to that work, Kyle and I, when we were trying to interpret our data, I was very underwhelmed by the resources there available to helping to understand and explain what this is about historically, why we get these tenacious cultures of masculinity being constantly reproduced and so on. Trying to do it differently, I just had an exchange. Sean Williams is a super wonderful postdoc up at Edinburgh who's been teaching on those short contracts that young people suffer these days, and he revamped a course of theirs, and he sent me an email. We met last week, and he was telling me about this. He managed to get almost equal gender parity in admissions to this course. For the second time he taught it, for a series of reasons that he gives there. It's clearly open and plural aesthetically, and in its cultural and social approaches, the course. He downplayed the techie side of it. None of it was about images of complicated electronic equipment in windowless studios, hides the very technical nature of a lot of it. He's assuming that electronics and technical issues put off a lot of female would-be students on these courses. It's very interesting to see. This is just Sean, just experimenting with the course he was running. What if commitments were made everywhere to do this kind of experiment? I think it's great.
Thank you. Now, Simon Emerson.
Thank you. Following on from two such erudite talks that locked so well together, I'm going to try to carry on one or two themes that I've heard based on what I've been scribbling. Firstly, Georgina and Kyle Devine asked me to contribute to the Contemporary Music Review 35.1, which is out any minute now. And I decided to do a horrible history, as it turned out. I didn't know that's how it was going to turn out. And I don't like, in a sense, the word revisionist history, because it's got bad vibes from a person of my generation, because revisionism had a specific political meaning in the 1960s. But it's needed, and it's very vital that some histories are looked at again and sorted out in different terms. And I dug out every single annual general meeting minute of the Electroacoustic Music Association of Great Britain, 1979, through Sonic Arts Network, 1989, through to 2004. That is 25 years of annual general meeting reports and board reports. Oh dear, I've got a complete set of them. I'm that kind of person. They were sitting there on my shelf, and there they were. And I engaged brain, got my memory thinking, and went through them in quite some detail for this issue. Well, Kyle and Georgina came back to me, having submitted the article, and said, well, you've just made a report. And I said, well, that's what I want to do. And they said, well, please try to say why you've come to some of these conclusions. So I'm not particularly happy with this article that's not yet come out. So my function tonight is I want to raise some questions, because I really don't know if the conclusions I come to in this article are valid or not. There are some preliminary discussions, but I haven't told you what they are yet. Let's go back a bit. Firstly, in the first 10 years of the Electroacoustic Music Association, after a couple of years, in fact, it was basically engendered by an Arts Council initiative that I was part of in the late 70s. For the first 10 years, there was not one single female board member. This fact alone caused me the first of my missed heartbeats. So I hadn't really thought about it. There were plenty of discussions on diversity of the canon, many discussions on what kinds of music we should be addressing. There were many discussions on London bias. I mean, many. Why are all our activities in London? Why can't we have in the north of England or Scotland, Wales, and other parts of the UK at the time? So that kind of exclusion was much debated. Academic exclusion, and by the way, there were some open access studios at that time. I've always been upset by the label that EMAS and Sonic Arts were fundamentally university concerns. There are very good reasons for that. As I try to say in the article, if you've got a salary, you can take a day off and it doesn't really matter. And your employer actually wants you to go down to London, have a meeting, and put it in your brownie points tick for the year, not only for your own promotion, but for research excellence frameworks and the like. Freelancers, that's much more difficult, and this was not properly addressed. There were freelance members of those boards, but it was always slightly more difficult for them to attend meetings. Such things tend to be forgotten about as history goes away from us, but it's very important. Still, the first 10 years, no female membership of the board at all. One or two co-opted members, but they were never elected. That was democracy, and indeed, looking at these minutes has made me question how, in fact, you run democratic systems, because the board was elected. People stood. The entire membership voted once a year. Very good. That's great so far. In 1989, first female member of the board happened to coincide with the change of name. Now, I think that's literally chance that it was the same year, but I'm genuinely interested in your views as to the changing nature of language. Was it significant that the organization changed to be called Sonic Arts Network, and that in the 1990s there were more female board members than there had ever been? My memory that it reached nearly 50% turns out to be erroneous. There were indeed 3 female board members sometime in the mid-90s, but I had clean forgotten that we'd nearly doubled the size of the board from 6 to nearly 12 people. So in fact, the proportions still were not improving very much. Nonetheless, a presence was undoubtedly felt. And by the late 90s, of course, the Arts Council and within the organization, we were creating equal opportunities documents, and the number of commissions moved much more rapidly to something approaching equality. It never reached 50%. That must be said. I do look at those figures in the article. CD issues, I'm afraid not. It was only at about 25 to 30%. But anyway, that had been some shift in the 1990s. The increase in the education area was extremely influential and significant in the late 80s to early 90s. The fact that an organization such as Sonic Arts Network took on an educational role, there was never any doubt, in fact, that at classroom level, at the entrepreneurial level, there were much more equal numbers between the two, run from a base in the north of England. The Huddersfield office, in fact, was set up to run the education side of Sonic Arts Network and existed based on Huddersfield for nearly 10 years in the end. Right, so language. I'm interested in language, whether in fact the way we describe what we do shifts the way that is perceived clearly. I think this is going to be one of the things we'll discuss. Around that time, too, there were shifts in the policies of the organization. There were several initiatives to set up a national studio for electronic music. IRCAM had been set up in France in the mid-1970s. Germany was moving towards the ZKM in Karlsruhe, and there was nothing in Great Britain. I now completely rewrite the history of the efforts to set up such an organization. I now, in fact, see such efforts as leading to an overdeveloped focus on a limited range of practices, which took our eye off the ball and, in fact, halted a wonderfully broadening range of practices that were coming into being in Britain in the 80s and 90s. This is part of an institutionalized problem that we face to this very day, that you are asked to predict the future when you ask for funding. This leads you to limit what you think might be done, because you have to deliver it. This is against all creative and evolutionary principles of the development of arts and culture. So, we have revision and reconfiguration. Actually, Georgina challenged me in an informal conversation to say, well, there clearly are more women in practice in the zeros of this century. What, in fact, has happened, and I do want us to discuss two kinds of changes. One, of course, engendered by the internet largely, which is what I call the horizontalization of genre. The ideas of curriculum reform are clearly way behind the practices we see around us in terms of the visibility of different practices. How come now that, in fact, there are groups around London, whether they're in universities or not, is not really my point, of very different kinds of practices with technology, and how these have, in fact, become a much more horizontal playing field with people moving around in various forms. I'm not talking gendered ideas there, I'm talking just different practices. Is it possible that, in fact, that rather than break into a male-dominated domain, female practitioners are merely setting up their own domains, which must now become part of this horizontal culture, which we need to include within the curriculum reforms we're talking about. I think that, in fact, visibility is absolutely fundamental to our world now. There's no particular end to our present discussion in terms of where we might move forward. I want to say that I'm here to listen, is that I really don't know. I've been teaching since 1974, and I have seen vast changes in the techniques and technologies around us. I think it's absolutely vital that we engage with these new constituencies, and I'm very keen on seeing a disbanding of what you might call a traditional view of genre, a traditional view of canon, and its replacement with a much more nuanced and much more generalized view of where we might go in our teaching practice. And I think that's going to be fundamental to any discussion about gender. I think that's where I'll leave it.
It's a bit daunting coming on after these three, I must say. But I'm going to try and tie things up, as you said, Aaron. So some of what I say will be pretty clear, and some will be a little bit cryptic, because that's the way I write. So beyond the classroom and concert hall, where else should we be sensitive to sources of gendering? Audio software, hardware, marketing, studio environments. If that's not bright enough, let's just say everywhere. Everywhere. Where should we not be conscious of sources of gendering? How are you gendered? Are you gendered? These are pretty important questions, because some people are more obviously gendered than others. So I've spoken before in numerous settings about the work that has been done addressing the gendering of music and technology, from Susan McClary to Barry Traux, Jonathan Stern, Anna Hilda Nessett and Tara Rogers, to name just a few. In particular, in answer to this question, I return to Andrew McCartney's 1995 paper, Inventing Images, Constructing and Contesting Gender in Thinking About Electroacoustic Music. In this paper, McCartney challenges dominant stereotypes of women through deconstructions of language and technology in the recording studio, where she traces the use of audio metaphors as embodying powerful and cognitive performative functions through early scientific and technological discourses that are modelled on violence and misogyny, which through repetition, through daily use and through advertising in specialist audio magazines, she claims, have come to seem natural. Tara Rogers extends McCartney's uncovering of early scientific and technological discourses through analyses of the dominant foundational discourses and origin stories of Western electronic music and sound studies. She does this by analysing the binary poles of noise and silence in ways that she asserts continue to be shaped through discourses of violence and domination and through colonial and neoliberal narratives. Following on from McCartney, Rogers, and many others, I have examined the ways in which audio-technical discourses and resultant aesthetic practice have been articulated through implicitly gendered, sexualized, and racialized discourses in ways that reproduce socio-acoustic norms as a kind of acoustic colonial management of race that travels through sexuality and imperialism, bound in notions such as perfect fidelity. The construction of perfect fidelity, for example, with all the associations of that term, traced through work done in communication theory and sound studies, suggests a line along which racial membership in a history of acoustics and audio-technical discourse has been drawn through a ubiquitous and fundamental frequency of heteronormal whiteness. What is bias? Well, for some people this is pretty obvious. Who is this less explicit to? An example of bias in audio-technical discourses and their associated aesthetic practices. Well, some historical notions of pitch have been understood as ideally disembodied and expressive of tonal purity. These were employed to provide a sense of musical coherence in both dominant discourses of Western music, such as the overtone series, and in later sound reproduction discourses focused on notions of perfect fidelity. These ideas implicitly reinscribe the reproduction of an existing cultural order, as Tara Rogers has explained. And they are based on beliefs in a true and natural order of the world. Such beliefs in a natural order have been manifest too in historical gender norms in which heterosexuality, as the original authority, was assumed to be a natural expression of an essential continuity between sex, gender, and desire that would seemingly point ahead in one straight direction only. Ideas about racial purity have also been articulated historically as essential, natural, and based on biological evidence rather than on constructions forged through the instrumentalization and functionalization of sexuality and slavery. As feminist musicologist Robin James explains, this belief in a natural order is one in which individuals have to be disciplined so they more perfectly conform to the natural order that they already ought to manifest in the first place. This disciplining, bias, and stereotype is often only implicit to those who are not the target of bias or who are not stereotyped. Being the target of bias and being stereotyped is an explicit experience. Generally speaking, people of colour know what it is like to be white better than white people. Female-identified people know what it is like to be male better than men. Diversity quotas. What is the intention? Well, I know that I've been, and I am, a body that ticks the diversity box. And the leaky pipeline continues to ensure that that is all I can be. So it's a double-edged sword. But unlike some, I don't suffer from exceptional woman syndrome, and I would very much like, indeed, I need more people who can deal with racism, sexism, ableism, all the other isms, and their own implication in the reproduction of these. So if that's what the goal is about, then yes, diversity quotas might be useful. But actually, the real meaning of a question such as the one that Ruth Ginsburg posed about the Supreme Court depends on who you mean by we. How far off are we from being assimilated? Do we want something else? Who is this we within this goal that is useful for music technology? So you probably can't read this very well, so I'm going to read it out for you. It's a quote from a woman called Kavita Banot, who writes in Media Diversified, and I've changed a few words in what she's said. Although the lack of interest in our work on the part of white composers is a very real problem, when we respond to and celebrate diversity, we don't deeply challenge a white system. We only appeal to it, try to fit ourselves into it, make ourselves attractive to it, trying to sell our diversity. We go to workshops that tell us how, as BAME artists, composers, coders, we can brand ourselves to get better, package ourselves, make ourselves more marketable, to get funding, to find a publisher, to sell music. And in this way, we define ourselves through this system, softening ourselves, performing our identities and ethnicities for it. Perhaps there's little choice when you're entering the mainstream space as an isolated individual, as a composer or a programmer. It's the only way to get in and survive. We don't talk about racism, just lack of diversity. As Alan Berry says in a recent article, diversity is for white people. The big lie behind a well-intended word, diversity is how we talk about race when we can't talk about race. It has become a stand-in when open discussion of race is too controversial, or let's be frank, when white people find the topic of race uncomfortable. Diversity seems polite, positive, hopeful. Simply diversifying will not change anything unless social constructions that produce the diverse body in the first place are addressed. The effect is not the cause here. Whose values are these? And is this discussion doing a disservice to the already rich tradition of women in the history of music technology? Yes, this is a disservice. Be interested. Learn to listen, not to dismiss work that you might not understand. Learn what discrimination is and how you might be implicated in reproducing it. Stand up and speak out against it. Support others who do this work. Read more widely. Do not assume that you can share a legacy with those who have been systematically othered by a system that you might benefit from. Be respectful of the need for safe spaces. Do the hard work of your own emotional labour. Become aware of your own assumptions of entitlement. All axes of difference are intertwined. One is not racialised without being gendered. As whiteness studies scholar Richard Dyer emphasises, race and gender are ineluctably intertwined through the primacy of heterosexuality in reproducing the former and defining the latter. If we transpose this into ideas about pitch, for example, then the disembodied, often historically silenced pitch attributed to idealised representations of virtuous white femininity and the normative representations of the pure tone associated with a dominant, virile, rational white masculinity, both invariably understood to be lacking body, can be heard implicitly as reproducing ideals associated with concepts of both whiteness and heteronormativity. Similarly to normative understandings of race, sex, and gender, whereby historically, as Judith Butler has demonstrated, gender has been assumed to be determined by an a priori and stable sex, and as Dyer explains, race and gender are intertwined through a primacy of heterosexuality that reproduces race and defines gender. Pitch and timbre can be appreciated as being intertwined through the notion of perfect fidelity, where perfect fidelity reproduces pitch and defines timbre. In this way, future relations of gender, music, and race can be appreciated as intending to reproduce hegemonically hierarchical, normative, and for some, precarious demographics. What are the criteria of reproduction? An analogy. Feminist musicologist Robin James' critique of the avant-garde open work and post-tonal musics as operating upon a deregulatory impulse. She suggests that the avant-garde open work may be perceived as operating analogously to forms of economic deregulation. By deregulation, James means a symptomatic process governed by tightly controlled background conditions that generate foreground randomness, which in turn supports and reaffirms the background. In other words, the practice of choice within this system is not only illusory, but is also the necessary statistical mechanism that regulates the overall normalization of a system. Deregulation considered in this way may be further thought of as a kind of matrix, whether that be heterosexual, colonial, economic, political, or auditory matrix. In other words, a regime of intelligibility. Open calls and competitions and employment opportunities are always structured, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly. Think of ageism, for example, in many competition calls, according to a set of background conditions. Cultural workers need to take responsibility for what they produce. 7, help. What should existing professional organizations of electronic musicians do to help? The difficulty and frustration is that the diverse body knows these statistics intimately and has often been expressing this for so long. But the diverse body is not listened to. Only when those higher up point out statistics do they register as a blip in the transmission, and even then, it's often just a way of making some seem ethical. What can you do? Address racism, sexism, ableism, classism, nationalism. It's not really such a difficult question to answer. Stop looking to the body that you have classified as diverse to provide your answers for you, for problems you continue to make and privileges you continue to benefit from. Give us the space we need to try to deal with and heal from the violences inflicted upon us, and consider the ways in which you too may be implicated in the reproduction of everyday violence. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the panelists for those thoughtful, provocative, moving, beautiful statements. So now I'd like to begin a more free-flowing discussion between the 5 of us and getting ready to open it up to all of you. Maybe I'll begin with a question that I think follows somehow through all 4 of your statements, but I hope you'll just take it as a springboard for a lot of other implications. So a few of the studies that we heard about from Victoria, from Georgina, terminated the data about 2010, 11 or so. In the time since then, it seems to me that not necessarily regarding movement on gender or diversity, but regarding movement on what we consider music technology, titles like sound art, something maybe we could call embodied performance technology, have made a great increase in different kinds of funding, institutionalization, recognition. However, maybe they've also made an increase in being taken over by masculine gendered people who did not necessarily originate those practices.
I was simply going to say that I think also, probably, Erin, tell me if I'm wrong, you were trying to signal a pluralization of what now counts and is being taught and is recognized within the academy. Is that partly what you were saying?
Well, maybe. I guess that was what I wanted to put a question mark after.
Partly, yeah. And I mean, you know, what can I say? Through my studies, I saw a bit of this, but there's no question, someone will forgive me, that EA, you know, electroacoustic music was still, as it were, the paradigm, the dominant paradigm, you know, under which sort of 1,000 flowers could bloom. But nonetheless, you know, the fact that 1,000 flowers or 50 flowers might bloom now inside the university trainings as opposed to outside seems to me some kind of progress and something you were talking about. But I want to go further than this querying of to say that, you know, I have in mind, just to baffle our assumptions on this, is you know, for example, I came across a genre of what's called body music, right? And some of the practitioners of body music are men, and they do this thing where they bare their upper bodies and they have sensors all over them, or you know, and they're working with sound as a plastic form through all this movement and so on, half naked in the dark. And you know, I mean, to me, I don't know what I think about that. You know, that to me is nothing to do with a kind of undoing of the gendering of things. To me, it's just, if I'm honest, it's a form I don't find particularly persuasive. But so I'm not sure something like that is to do with gender in any way, actually. But it's to do with sensors and their ease of use, and you know, the power of what you can do in live performance by utilizing them in certain ways and stuff. And I guess I'm trying to say there's a masculinist way of doing that stuff as well. Just, you know, so anyway, it's not a very helpful intervention.
Well, I'm at sea on this one because I confess that when I listened to Radio 4 2 days ago, the Today programme had an item on the difference between female and male brains within a particular educational environment. And I've, as a good 1968 person, I've tried extremely hard to undo such things. And here I am, 40 years later, come full circle. And I need help as to whether those descriptions are in fact what they actually mean, because I'm convinced that they're used very briefly and very quickly, especially in soundbite terms on radios. And this was from the neurosciences. So what does it mean to say there are differences between a female brain and a male brain? I celebrate, forgive me, I mean diversity of the world. I want things to be different. I don't want them to be the same. That's the first point. So I'm really interested in how that language is constructed again, because it clearly isn't the same as when I was a student. There's something else going on. And are the neurosciences our allies or not? I don't know. I can't answer.
Do you have a thought about that, Holly?
Oh, well, I don't think I've met many of them that I would call allies. I mean, if you think historically, what is neuroscience done for us? No, really. I mean, it emerges from technologies of, you know, phrenology and categorizing bodies according to differences. So I think that it's social construction. I am a social constructionist. I'm very firmly within that camp. And so the construction of the language around neurotechnologies and biotechnologies and all of those sciences, I believe, are very dominating, you know, domineering. They are intending to organise society along very specific ways. And the division of saying that my brain is different to yours is basically about, okay, it probably has developed differently, but that would be through different inputs throughout life. I don't think that I was born with a particularly different brain to you.
Well, one thing that some of us sort of discussed informally before this panel is to spend a lot of our time perhaps trying to, rather than rephrase a lot of the statistics that we know to think about what next directions are. So I'm going to refer to a question from our followers on the internet, from Liz Dobson, who who would have loved to be here, but she asks, how do you think we can compel more people, i.e. men, to truly engage proactively in influencing change so that the responsibility doesn't fall so directly on the demographic that is affected? And she preceded that by pointing out that many women are spending a lot of their writing, research, thought, time doing things exactly like what we're doing here tonight, when maybe they could be making more music, more art. Do you agree? What can we do?
I think she's right. I mean, she was at the WizWars session back in April that I attended, and she works with Linda O'Keefe a lot. And I think it was very interesting because at that session, all of the teachers, because it was, as I said, it was academics, teachers, all of the teachers were women. Obviously, all the students were girls. That was a decision. But most of the people there, practitioners and academics, were all women. And there were 3 men there. I won't say which university they came from, but they came looking for help about how to improve the gender issue, as they called it, in their university. And so the 3 of them came en masse. And one of the questions I said to them was, well, you know, what's your interest above and beyond trying to sort out the gender demographic? And they said, well, that's really it. You know, we just need we're getting quite a lot of flack. So we actually need to just divvy it up. And I said, well, what does your department look like? And he said, well, there are no women in our department for a start. And I said, well, that's something you could actually do something about, even before you start to think about pedagogy and other things. So, yeah, I think Liz is right to say that those who are most affected do spend a lot of our time trying to, again, maybe it is a sort of part of that sort of feminist activism. So you are feeling that your work needs to have a sort of a reason beyond it in of itself, you know, that the research needs to be meaningful. And that's maybe because women have been disproportionately affected by these sorts of biases and marginalisation, and therefore it's almost like a sort of moral duty to feel that you have to sort of intervene in some way through your work.
I'd like to come in, and it sort of follows on from the previous question too, but just talk about the significance of institutions, and among them, you know, curricula, and what's on the agenda in degree programs and other teaching situations. And it seems to me, just to finish a thought from the last question, that a pluralization of what practices are acknowledged, recognized, taught, even if there's a hierarchy, there will always be a hierarchy of what's taught, really matters. It valorizes things. Every time something enters, it's valorized in certain ways. That's, you know, it's legitimized. It gets into the degree program, the curriculum, the sound art training, whatever it is. So that Simon came to this at the end about the horizontalization of genre and so on, and I just wanted to make the point fully that it really matters. But it seems to me, to Liz's point, that I would address this in, the forms, actually very similar forms, work for race. And that is the 2 meanings of representation. Okay, and there are 2 meanings to representation. And they are people being employed, hiring, people being promoted, you know, the whole politics of who gets valorized in the terms of having jobs, getting onto the EMAS board, running programs, deciding on curricula and so on. That's one form of representation. The other is representation in the terms of the contents of what is taught, the aesthetics that are acknowledged and valorized, the practices that are valorized. It seems to me that both matter, that if Liz asks, how can men help to affect change, and they should, then it's recognizing that both of those things count. They're not reducible one to the other. They're not identical. You can put lots more women into a program when there are none. That matters. It's really good. It doesn't mean that the content, there's no essentialism here. It doesn't automatically change, right? You can also change the curriculum if you can do nothing else in terms of appointing more women, or black people, or non-whites, or non-heterosexual, whatever it is, right? So both of these things, we've known this for a very long time. You know, this is one approach to cultural politics, and it matters. Both matter, and they're not reducible one to the other. So it seems to me that, but this is where a tiny bit of blue sky between us, Holly, you and I, because you quite rightly in your wonderful rap, you talked about diversity quotas and you undid them, and you gave a much deeper kind of ethical take on self-reflection in regard to all of these forms of power and so on and so forth, which was all salutary and important. But I still think diversity, the boxes also matter. I've just been part of a debate on the BBC. We've got it. We've got diversity written into the BBC's charter for the first time. You know, and we did it by arguing that Channel 4 had done this from its inception 25 years ago, and the BBC has utterly failed to really take, you know, major steps in this regard. These things matter enormously, but they don't matter in and of themselves. What matters equally, and on our board of people working on the BBC, what we should be, you know, banging on the door for the new charter was a young lecturer from Goldsmiths, a black colleague, and he and I together did a lot of work on this, and it was him who said it's not about appointments anymore, it's actually about the qualities of representation, of what we see on screen. That's why really talented young black television and film producers don't stay in the BBC, because they're not allowed to do really interesting projects and put out great black film on the BBC. BBC won't take those risks, right? So both ends. Sorry, that's a very long. Right.
But it sounds like you're touching on a lingering bias in the music field, that there isn't some kinds of representation because what people are making is abstract, that there is not some diversity that's being failed to have represented when those making it isn't diverse.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
Can I raise a means, which I mentioned briefly, language, because although I was not part of our last two recruitment drives where I am at Montfort, I know that a great deal of effort was put into rethinking the wording of advertising, and very specifically the diversity of genre version, which was about 2 years later than an earlier one, clearly broadened the field. I mean, there was no question that language was fantastically important. I haven't yet decoded this completely for myself, because the way I read it was they merely included every kind of genre of music made with technology I could possibly have thought about and that existed. But it helped. I won't say it worked, I won't say that. It helped enormously. I have no idea, we'll maybe discuss that with the audience later. And language and expression, I think, is absolutely fundamental.
I feel like a lot of the positive steps we've been alluding to are more in the direction of higher education, large institutions. We haven't spoken very much yet to what's happening at primary, secondary education level. Have you seen some positive steps, Victoria?
I don't think there's an awful lot going on. I think that oh God, it sounds so depressing, doesn't it? I'm going to start to feel really gloomy now. For a start, we all know, we're all in this room because we're interested in the arts and music generally, and we know it's being massively marginalised under this current government. And probably anybody trying to recruit in higher education at the moment is probably wringing their hands and probably wondering if they're going to have a department in 5 years, quite frankly. There may not be, because we're not having young people coming through taking music. And I think the problem is there are so many other pressures that gender isn't really on the agenda. I don't think people really think about it in schools. Certainly if you look at current teacher training, it's very instrumental. There's very little space for reflection other than reflecting on your actual practice if you look at various teacher training courses. So it's really very much about how to rather than why. And there's very little space to even talk about other issues around ethnicity, sexuality. All of these things do not find their way into teacher training. And I don't think it's on anyone's radar, because there are so many external pressures for teachers in terms of accountability, testing. It's just not there. They don't see it as, and they may individually see it, talking to teachers, be interested in this, but they can't find spaces to actually make it, meaningfully inform their work, because there are so many other things going on. So I think it's, at least in higher education, we actually have more flexibility, because we do actually have control of our own curricula. We do write our own courses, and therefore we can take a lot more responsibility. But sadly, teachers don't have that autonomy. And frankly, the curriculum is getting more prescriptive by the minute. So I think the problem is that what's happening before they get to us in higher education is really not a good news story. And again, teachers are working under such really difficult situations that I don't think this issue of diversity and thinking more sort of sociologically about their practice is really there. Again, it's your leaky pipe theory, except for I think I'm not even sure it's a leaky pipe. I'm not sure what it is. I think it's just a puddle. We haven't even, seriously, I don't think, because that would presuppose that there's a bit that we go through and then there's a bit of a drop off, but I think there's probably just a puddle and it never gets to the pipe.
There is a drop-off, interestingly, in that research, at every stage. In other words, young girls are engaging with music technologies, and then by 11 they're less, and by 16 less, by 18 less, and so on. I was just some totally lateral thinking and really not very clever, but one thing is about how in the UK we've failed, risibly, to introduce programming. At primary school level, actually, and therefore to change the relationship of the broad cohorts of school kids to computer programming and technicity per se, And I think one of the interesting foldbacks from circuit bending or hacking cultures and whatever is that, there really has been a kind of depletion of the kind of the young engineer, the capacity to just play with objects and work with material things, and that kind of element in primary schooling and secondary schooling. My kids, when they went through, they had something called design technology or something. It was appallingly controlled and minimal and didn't allow them to get the joy of, the tactile engagement with making things and so on and so forth. So I think also there's a way in which what we see in the diversity of music, tech and sound art and hacking cultures is something that tells us something much more general about the culture and about our culture of education, all the way through. I don't know if the States is different or Scandinavia, whatever. I wish, because, we are in an era when we need that set of engagements with the material. I don't know if others, so gender is one element of that, but maybe it would be shifted if altogether these things were given a different kind of valorization in a much more general way earlier.
And I think it takes, we just need to start thinking about things differently and from a much earlier stage. But again, there's not much of a policy will. There's no will at policy level to, we had a new curriculum, half years ago it was introduced. Some schools, depending on whether academies or free schools, may or may not have to follow the national curriculum. The national curriculum itself was, it was a bit of a mucking about. There was no real wholesale, a way of saying, right, how can we fundamentally improve it? There was some, changing to computer studies, to bring programming in at secondary level. Whether we'll see any of that impacting the take-up of music technology, I don't know. A bit early to say in the cycle. But again, it's this lack of sort of joined-upness between the different, at policy level, what's happening in terms of what teachers need to be doing, the needs of the kids themselves. And so, but I don't think there's a will on the part of policymakers. And when they're diddling around with the curriculum, they don't think in a really creative, I don't feel there's any creativity in the new curriculum when you look at it. It just seems more and more circumscribed and fewer opportunities to really engage with free play and really think imaginatively. and children's creativity being stimulated and supported. It seems to be really difficult to find spaces to do that.
Maybe this would be a good time to open it up to the floor, especially because I love the fact that Holly's left her help slide up. So we have a wireless microphone, and Ben will bring it to you. So please.
Well, thank you very much for a really interesting debate. I'm Yumi from University of East London, and I have some of my colleagues here, Helen and Joe. So you see, we have women teachers at University of East London, and we have a music technology course and music performance and production courses. And the music performance and production is like a traditional instrumental and singing kind of performance. And music technology is more computer-based. But in fact, 75% of the modules we share. So we actually teach almost the same thing, but the title is different, and some specialist modules. Still, we attract very different kind of student cohort. And we actually do not teach traditional Western art music as such. We do some contemporary thing, but not classical music. So even the performance and production courses, we mainly teach popular music. But still we have the similar kind of difference, which Georgina pointed out. Very, very similar in the class-wise, gender-wise, and ethnic diversity. So there's something really about the name music technology attracts different kind of students. And also the interesting thing, even though we are dealing with popular music, still the genre differences. So I suspect mainly the music technology students mostly interested in, say, hip-hop, quite gendered kind of genre, I have to say. So that may be a different kind of student cohort. And another thing I just wanted to say, it's about the quota system. Georgina just mentioned when she went to the prog rock thing last week. And because when I'm not working at University of East London, I work as a musician with ex-colleague of Georgina, with the ex-Henry Cow people, happened to be. And when I attended Lindsay Cooper's memorial concert 2 years ago, and all the female musicians who were not playing there were replaced by men. And that was really shocking because Henry Cow was supposed to be most gender-balanced band in the history of the whole rock music, I have to say. And another band, News from Babel, was 75% women. But that was really shocking. So even though a band like Henry Cow, the men have to be reminded, kept on reminded about it, because I couldn't really believe that they would forget about it. So when I organized the Lindsay Cooper Memorial Concert in Japan, I made sure the quota system, at least half musicians must be women. So we did, and we're going to play, again, at least half the members, women in France at Rock Imposition Festival this year. So I think really quota, we really have to think about it, or we really have to keep reminding everyone about it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just pass it?
Sure.
This is about why, one of the reasons I think there might be so many young men who are so good at using music technology, because I came into higher education after working on estates in Southwark about 20 years ago. And at that time, one of the policies of the council for stopping young men from being involved in drugs and gun crime was to give them studio time. And actually the money went from what I was working with, which was young women, to young men who had problems with guns. And the job became, rather than a paid job, it went to volunteers from the Ministry of Sound who wanted to work with young men who had gun and drug crime, criminal records, which is possibly why there are so many songs about drugs and guns. But to this day, a lot of funding goes towards keeping young men off the street by giving them music projects. Now it's not so much the local councils, it's more sort of charity funding, but it's seen as a really good way, because it's creativity, obviously, a really good way of using up young men's time. And that is to do with young men as being seen as a problem, which is a sort of parallel thing to what actually happens in schools and things. So I think it's a very kind of complicated situation. And I think it's probably okay to say that, you know, some of the students we teach have been in prison, and that possibly some of the things that, I mean, one of our best students a few years ago had loads of time to play his keyboard really well, you know, and it's not actually funny, it's true, and I think that if you look at the whole picture of what's actually being done, I found it terrible that the money went from the young women, because I thought they really needed their music. But they weren't regarded as a problem, because their role in life was to look after their younger siblings, rather than going out and causing damage that people complained about. So it's a very, very complicated social issue, the way that people are taught how to use music and what music's actually for.
Yeah. Could I just come in a sec and say, I'm very interested in your point there, partly because this lower social class white body of young men we found going into the music technology degrees really it very much it's not exactly the same as what you're saying, but to me it triggers this, you know, this question that there is a way that lower class and working class white masculinity and black masculinity are somehow also being made into problems. And, you know, it behoves us here not just to be talking about genderqueer women, but into this way that particularly young masculinity is somehow being, you know, and I'm not saying these aren't real problems, but in the policy world, I mean, Victoria will know very well that one of the major debates is about white working class masculinity, and you're giving another picture on this. There's something incredibly interesting there, and the way music plays into it or meets it or is deemed to meet it, or, you know, it's incredibly interesting to me.
Just a couple of things. One observation that I found really interesting sitting here is there was quite a lot of resistance to putting the gendering in tuition, but with all due respect, there was a lot of gendering of masculinity as well. So if you listen back to the thing, you'll find that certain things more than once I heard being ascribed, oh, masculine situation. And I find that a bit unusual, but that's besides the point. What I did before this is I talked to Warp Records, because they're one of the most established electronica records, just to get a better grasp of what's going on. And then they sent me to their site, and I found that out of their published signing, 5 out of 51 are women, which is a 10%, which is possibly more than in rock music, if you look at the rock bands, the canonistic rock bands. And then also in terms of artists, I found that there was about 7.5% female. So it's not as bad as it looks. And then I spoke to 2 artists just to see what they thought. I said to them, I mean, it's shit, but it's better than it was. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's a case of it's moving somewhere, you know? But, so I spoke to them saying, what do you guys think of all this gender issue? Layla, who's a really established artist with Warp, her first answer was, yeah, man, Prince's 4 of his best albums, the engineer was woman. Does anyone know that? She talked about Mandy Parnell, one of the top mastering musicians. She goes, where is she? Then Ed Handley from Plaid followed it through by saying, there is improved reception, seems people are less sexist, change has got to happen with the men, they need to become less sexist and condescending. And he also went on to say that history of women in music, this is a male electronica artist, which really goes in hand with your thing of visibility and your thing of role models. I think one of the key things missing here is this lack of role models. And furthermore, as education, as someone who came outside of music education, the majority of these artists have never been taught in any conservatory or institution. So that's another thing you've got to consider while we talk about, oh, there's this many, but what are they doing with it at the end of the day? So that's, I think, another consideration. Yeah, and then also dance music, DJing. Apparently, Ed was saying that's one area where he sees a really big change. He's actually seeing female names on flyers for the first time in the last 5-10 years. So we've got to take into account where these educational people end up, where these people, so it's engineering, DJing, and producing and performing, and then actually seeing how many people get there. And like, you know, I was told about somebody Derbyshire, Cozy Fan Tutti in the 80s. They were giving me names saying, look, Roy, there's a lot of females who've made a difference, but they're just not out there. Same story with the Beethovens and the canons of classical music. Women have got buried.
Should we comment?
Yeah. Thank you, Roy. Yeah, I'd love to hear the panel's comments.
Yeah. Just to say, we have 2 papers in our Contemporary Music Review issue, which is about many things, this issue, but one is on women DJs, and I'm afraid takes a much more negative view of the prevalent and continuing sexism of the dance scene, both for women DJs and on the dance floor, interestingly. Not something I have, lots of nodding over there. Second one is about the dubstep grime, and is, in my mind, listen to what I was about to say masterful. Isn't that great? What can I say? A tremendous paper. And what she's doing is tracing what she argues are kind of gendered affective cultures around these topics over generations, and arguing that there's a way in which the gendering of dub actually manages in certain ways to be inherited by later genres. I think it's an incredibly interesting argument, because what we're talking about here are historical processes. Why do things stay the same or not? And when do they change and why? So we need more of this kind of work, right? And anyway, 2 great papers for you to look at when this stuff comes out. On the somebody Derbyshire, it happens. There's an enormous amount of work being done, not by me, but by Holly, Kathy Lane, others, Francis Morgan over there. Lots of people are working on, and lots of male colleagues too, actually, on doing deep work on the foremost, electronic musicians of the 20th century, instating, I'm not saying reinstating, instating their work, and creating archives that valorize them and so on. But I was sitting here thinking, why don't you know about it? And why don't lots of people know about it? And I'm thinking, well, we have to, frankly, we'll talk about this, but you're all thinking about this all the time. I'm not. I'm sorry if I'm not meaning to be condescending, but somehow it has to come into the center, doesn't it? It has to be known so that everybody does know about this work, it seems to me. And it's very interesting in a discussion like this that not everybody does know about it.
But if these works, they only reach us. Look at the number of people sitting here. No, with all due respect, there is one thing about academia. There's a disjunction between academia and the social world. So there's a lot of things that get discussed, but somehow you've got to get into the rubbish Sun, into the Times, into the Guardian. You've got to get into where the people are, rubbish television programs. I'm not being funny, but that's where people get their information, not here. How many people read these articles? We may, but who else? Who else out there? The young people you want to influence, who you want to say, wow, there's been women who've done, you can do it. How do we empower them unless we get the information out to the public?
But I don't think it's just about academics sharing this. I think I was trying to say in my paper, what's happening in the classroom is a sort of reflection of sort of wider social processes. And I think, therefore, it's incumbent on us, and I think Holly made this point, it's incumbent on everyone to take responsibility for sharing practice, for sharing knowledge, for introducing other people to really good examples of practice. And therefore, it's everybody's responsibility, because if you just see it as academics' responsibility, we're not going to get anywhere, quite frankly. If you just see it as teachers, we're not going to get anywhere. It's got to be a wholesale change, and everyone, I think Holly's right, everyone has to take responsibility.
Yeah, I guess I'm not that much of a masochist. I'm quite a masochist, but I'm not interested in the sun. I'm not. I'm not interested in that kind of discourse, and that's not a place for me. I'm not the mascot of diversity that's going to explain it to everybody, because one, I've tried that and it doesn't actually work. You know, I still am that othered body and the structure still remains. So whilst, yeah, I agree in archives and searching out hidden histories. My work is about historical amnesias. All of these things are incredibly important. I think that there are ways in which those linguistic narratives need to change so that change does actually happen, so that we don't implicitly still reproduce the same hierarchies.
I just wanted to say, I wanted to ask if, Frances, you might speak to this, because I wanted to add to this simply that wherever people are working, some people here are working in the media, have worked in the media, that's where the work is. I mean, that's where the task is, as it were.
Thanks, Georgina. Yeah, I wanted to just speak a little bit to what you were saying, because firstly, of course, I absolutely hear you on academia, and I think a lot of academics hear you on academia too. I'm currently in the sort of odd position of having been or still being a music journalist, but I'm currently in academia. I'm currently doing a PhD. So I suppose I have a sort of perspective from both worlds. One thing I wanted to say, in order to respond to your point about the kind of mass media coverage of whichever artists we're talking about, I think that there's a very big gap between academia and like The Sun or whatever. And I feel like what we're talking about is work that whoever it's made by kind of falls in between those poles. So I think that one thing I would say is that pretty much no one from Warp has ever appeared in The Sun, right? Not just a woman, but like any of their artists. So I feel like what we are kind of talking about here, what we need to sort of maybe be a bit more attuned to with that kind of argument is that we are talking about musical subcultures, whether that's the subculture of electroacoustic music, which I know, I mean, to call that a subculture probably seems quite strange to you, Simon, I don't know, but in terms of its reach and who knows about it, right? It is kind of subcultural. Dance music, of course, it has its big stars, but the kind of thing we're talking about here is kind of subcultural. So I think that's really important when we talk about exposure. Like why is it incumbent upon women or female-identified people or black people, you know, to be the ones who are paraded in the mass media? No one would expect that of the guy from Plaid, for example. No one expects him to represent himself in the Daily Mirror, right? Maybe and there's a whole discussion as to why that's right or wrong. So that was something I did want to just sort of respond to that. But it's a really good point to bring up, the role of academia in exploring and discussing subcultures, you know, in conflating subcultures. I mean, that's a whole another discussion. As to the histories of electronic music, as Georgina, you know, that's one of my big interests. But I think that's kind of another strand to this. I suppose one thing I would say is that the media that is afforded to us by social media, by Twitter and by other forms of internet, social media, have kind of opened up an interesting space where those figures and those stories are being discussed. Now, as some of you know, I've got some problems with how that is done, but the fact is that it is being done, whether that's in a soundbitey, BuzzFeedy way or in a more in-depth way, such as like Holly's fantastic blog, which I've been reading lately. You know, I think that's when we're going to talk about the media, we also have to talk about that. That's incredibly important. We have to talk about YouTube. We have to talk about someone ripping a record and sticking it on YouTube. All those things now constitute the media and representations within it, I think.
Thanks. I want to talk about change, about inspiring people, and about very practical steps. And it was interesting to hear this idea that it's everybody's responsibility. It's not just academia's responsibility. My name's Terry. I've just programmed Music Tech Fest and produced Music Tech Fest in Berlin. This is Sarah, our community manager. And we've had more amazing artists, amazing female artists, diversity than ever before in this, our 10th edition. We've reached out enormously to female pressure, Feminatronic, women produce music, to get in emerging producers, hackers, and also make sure that some really interesting artists who aren't perhaps known for their work with music technology as much, like Eska, a Mercury-nominated artist who loves hacking and actually won a hacker prize, as well as creating lots of work from scratch at the festival. So we've been reaching out and working very hard, and there's still more work to do, but we're very proud of that. We had an open submissions process, and I went through every single submission, and there were quite a lot of women. We'd love to have more women, but there were quite a lot. But what was very noticeable was that of the applicants, a lot of them weren't backed by a business or by an academic institution and couldn't afford to come to this particular edition in Berlin. We'd love to have a bigger budget and be able to bring absolutely everybody we'd like to, but we don't. And looking at it also as a musician and what happens in other areas of music, I feel it would be really good to talk about perhaps small but concrete things that could happen to enable women to be inspired by other women working in music technology, or to attend events like Music Tech Fest or Sonar or South by Southwest or wherever. And, for example, PRS have a scheme of kind of grants and bursaries for women who produce music. And I'd like to know, is there any organisation that could be persuaded to do something similar in music technology? Because so much is about visibility and about people inspiring other people. So I'd love to hear from you, who are much better placed in this world than I am in many ways, how we can do things like this.
Thank you.
Well, if I can speak to one thing, and it links to what you're saying completely. I was going to say, I'm an academic and I'm proud. I think it's very important that at least we hold the ideal of healing breaches and doing our little bit. I mean, I may have nothing in common with a lot of our national press and other media, but I have to hope that as the original aim of the 1997 government was to move to 50% of 18-year-olds receiving some kind of higher education, that's 50%. That's pretty good. And I think that the university as a locus for music making is, in many senses, has to be redesigned and maintained, but changed. So when I'm told you must do more gigs off campus, yes, but we deliberately balance those with the gigs on campus in the hope that the division between the two reduces. So I think it's really vital that we see what we do as integrated into the social fabric, potentially, so that if the Sun newspaper wishes to report on it, well, great. I'm not particularly going to sell it to them, but if they're there, that's okay. Or if it's somebody from Radio 3, that's okay too. So I see our role as potentially enormously socially positive, and I absolutely believe in that role, and that we must be proud of what we do, essentially, in this contribution.
But do you think we could do even more in sort of sensitising our students to these issues? Because when they go out into the world as freelancers and they find their ways into setting up, collectives, setting up festivals and what have you, there's a sort of sensibility and awareness. And so we can do, so it isn't just a case of, getting a sort of more equal representation, but actually it's the sort of critical work that we need to do with them, so they take this forward in their own practice. So again, it's a case of we have a responsibility in HE, but it's not, a lot of this stuff doesn't happen in higher education. It happens outside of it. They're only with us for 3 years. It's if they live to 90, it's the tiniest part of their lives. So it's actually what happens afterwards when they go out and with their sort of, the sort of neoliberal entrepreneurial hats on. They're expected to, sustain their own careers and do all this work. How we enable that to happen. And there are structural issues because it's around funding. And it's around people like you who, again, have a very clear idea that you are looking for good practice. It's not just women per se, but it's women who do good work. So again, it is it's taking this out. Again, it's taking this out into a sort of into the wider world, and that we've always got to have an eye on that. Otherwise, it becomes something very insular. We might pat ourselves on the back for doing, we've increased diversification in our courses, but actually, it's what you're doing. It's something else inside that, and how they take those messages out into their own work.
I just want to add that all of this is great, but we also need to reinterpret history. And, until we can teach a history that has many, many more women figures in it, which we could probably, then, that seems to be that we have to work on both those fronts. And that's a really difficult one because, speaking from the universities again, the way we teach the history of 20th century music, let alone the 19th, 18th, 17th, 16th, it's very tied up, and tied up in careers that are committed to certain accounts of history and so on and so forth. So that's tricky. But what was the other thing I want to say? Luckily, I've forgotten.
I think funding is such a difficult one when you're marginalised in some way. I recently had an experience where I applied for some funding to go to an event on queer sound arts, and I didn't receive funding because there weren't enough people that wanted to go. So it wasn't even about that there wasn't the money available. It was because there weren't enough people that identified in that way and wanted to go and do that. So I don't have an answer for the thing about funding in any way. I think that the criteria, again, of who gets funded, that's the problem. And whether that comes back to, different histories need to be taught, different approaches to who a person is need to be taught, instilling definitely criticality in students and the people that we work with, then maybe, an environment might change.
I think that's a nice thought to, I won't say stop, but pause on for now. Unfortunately, we have to finish the formal part of this debate right there. But I hope as many of you as possible will join us for a drink at the Peasant nearby and carry on. If not there, carry on at other discussions with our wonderful panelists and each other in the future. Thank you, all four of you, for the time and attention you put into this evening, and thank you for your time and attention.